Hello. Today I'm going to be going over some Jews and slavery memes. Most of them are taken out of the Nation of Islam book called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. Usually just taking some quotes from there, which quote from some Jewish historians, and some are just from other sources and whatnot. But yeah, let's just get into it. So the first one I want to look at says, at the height of American slavery, 78% of slave owners were ethnic Jews, 40% of the Jewish population were slave owners, while only 0.35% of white Americans owned slaves. Okay, so if you go to the Jewish Virtual Library link and the Hillel.org link, the Virtual Jewish Library link just goes over the population of Jews in the U.S. historically. I don't know what that's to do with, like, owning slaves. And then the Hillel.org link gives Jewish population stats for, like, the U.S. in the early 1900s. So I don't even know why they're including those links. So if you look at Rodriguez, page 385, that's referring to the Historical Encyclopedia of World Slavery, edited by Junius Rodriguez. And page 385 talks about Judaism in the antebellum South. And the only part of that page that talks about like any numbers or statistics is this part where it says there were like 20,000 Jews residing in the antebellum South, and 5,000 Jews owned one or more slaves in the South. And they give the statistic that 1.25% of all the slave owners in the antebellum South were Jews. So at most you could say like 25% of the Jewish population of the South, bearing in mind that most of the Jews were in the North anyway, ever had slaves. And what's not discussed really is that Jews, because they are mainly in urban areas, usually only owned like one or two slaves, and weren't involved in like plantation enslavement type of things. I don't even really know where they're like kind of using that source, but like they're just using it totally incorrectly. And then also, I was going to make like a response meme to this, but someone else already did. And basically, it just says, at the height of American slavery, only 1.25% of slave owners were ethnic Jews from this source. 25% of Jewish households in the South owned slaves from the same source. And then it says, and 25% of white households in the South owned slaves. And that's where they're citing the correct source, like in context. And then also they go to this PolitiFact article that talks about how if you count like by households, that's where you get 25% of white households in the South owning slaves, because it's not necessarily, you don't want to necessarily look at like individual people, you want to go by household, because that is like a more correct way to look at it, because there are, a bunch of individual whites in the antebellum South, but obviously only like grown men who own homes are going to have slaves. So anyway, that's for that meme, and I'll put the sources in the description. The next meme I want to look at talks about Jewish slave ship owners, and it lists like around 10 or so ships and owners who are Jewish, and it says it's sourcing from Elizabeth Donnan's 4 volumes documents illustrative of the history of the slave trade to America. If you actually look at these volumes, you can look at them at our archive.org. The only volumes I could find that talk about or like list all the slave ship owners and the vessels and stuff like that are volumes 3 and 4. And if you go through these volumes, you see that it lists like hundreds of ship owners and hundreds of vessels. So I didn't find any chart that looks like this that actually like breaks it down by name of ship owners and ethnicity, but there are like some charts that break down the name of the ships and the owners, and you can also look at the index and it lists like every single one, and there's literally like hundreds of ships and hundreds of owners. So these people took like 10 or a dozen or whatever Jews and just like put them on this meme, but clearly if you look at the whole text, that's like a drop in the bucket, so it's kind of stupid it's just like a dumb meme, so that one's like barely needs to be addressed. And moving on, we get to these guys. These are quotes from the Nation of Islam book, which in turn quotes these guys from their own books. So we can just go through each one by one. The Seymour Liebman quote is talking about ships in general in the island of Curacao, which is in like the Caribbean, and it's talking about a time period when Jews were like, it's like one of the Caribbean islands that there was just like a lot of Jews at. And it was during like the 17th and early 18th century, which I'll get into later. But that was a time period like early on in the slave trade that, let's just say, wasn't as numerous in terms of like how many slaves were actually dealt with, for lack of a better term. And then the next one, the Wiznitzer quote about dominating the slave trade, is also talking about colonial Brazil in the mid 17th century. And also just a real quick tidbit about this book, Jews in Colonial Brazil. In the same text, he talks about Jorge Pinto, and specifically describes Pinto as not being Jewish, and like people saying he was, but in reality he wasn't. And I find that interesting because the Nation of Islam book, in a small section, they go over their quote unquote like chosen people, like being sarcastic, but like Jews essentially who were involved in the slave trade. So I don't know why they like take one part of his book, but then they didn't seem to read the whole thing. And like, I don't know, it's just like one person, but it leads me to think that like maybe they just want to call people Jews who aren't Jews, which wouldn't be too much of a stretch because a lot of these types of memes do that. But anyway, moving on to Cecil Roth's book. And that text is also talking about 17th century, early 18th century Marranos in South America. And Marranos were basically like conversos, Jews who converted to Christianity, usually under like pressure, more or less. And that's a big thing that the Nation of Islam looks at, is that they're not necessarily looking at Jews by like ethnicity and religion. It's more like converso, like secret new Christian types, like secret in the sense that like they may or may not have practiced Judaism in secret, but they were referred to as new Christians, but I'm going to get into that in a little bit. And then the Mark Lee Raphael quote, that is in the introduction to his book, and he cites a couple sources of just like primary source documents, like referring to some Jewish traders and stuff. I would say like that could be a generally accurate quote, but I don't know. It's a pretty generic one in just the introductory to his book, so it's not like a great quote really to like. I don't know. It's just like a pretty generic quote. Like it doesn't have that much like weight behind it. And I've actually never really heard much about the Jewish role behind like the French slave trade. But anyway, I'm going to get into some works that talk about the Jewish role. Yeah, let's just get into that because that's actually like more important than just these like isolated quotes. So the first secondary source I want to look at that kind of contextualizes some of this is the Encyclopedia of American Jewish History, Volume 2, under intergroup relations, talks about the relations between blacks and Jews a bit. And I think it's good to look at some of these secondary sources because that's essentially what these memes are doing. They look at secondary sources, take stuff either in context or out of context, and just like portray that as the whole, like the last word on it. But I mean, I could easily take stuff from these sources and do the same thing. For instance, page 418 of the Encyclopedia, where it states that overall Jewish merchants were accountable for considerably less than 2% of the slave imports into the West Indies and North America. And it also discusses the urban-rural divide, where a lot of Jews were urban, so they may have owned slaves in an urban setting, but that was not like, they didn't have like a great number of slaves in comparison to like plantation owners who had a lot more slaves. So that's just from that encyclopedia. But what I think is a more interesting source is the book Jews in the Civil War, and a portion of the book entitled Jews and New Christians in the Atlantic Slave Trade by Seymour Drescher. In this source, Drescher talks about how there were 3 phases of the Atlantic slave trade. The first phase being from 1500 to 1640, second phase being 1640 to 1700, and then 1700 to the British abolition in 1807. And he talks about the third phase being the most prominent, like numerically, and the first 2 phases being less so, and how in the first phase, new Christians, so not necessarily Jews, well, ethnically, I guess you could say, but conversos more or less, were prominent in the first phase, and mainly in the South American colonies of like Portugal. But once the Dutch took over, that was no longer really the case. And the second phase is where the slave trade moved on to the Caribbean, and where actual Jews, like who lived as Jews religiously, were also involved, but again, weren't necessarily like dominant. It talks about Curacao and how that was like a largely Jewish settlement, but again, that's not like the only Dutch-controlled area in the Caribbean, and it's not like the Dutch were the only slave traders at the time. So it says at most about 1/6 of the total Dutch slave trade through Curacao, which was largely, but not like totally, in the hands of Jewish merchants. So that's not necessarily like, you know, all of the Dutch slave trade or anything like that, but still considerable. And then he also talks a little bit about how, and you see this in some of the memes, that like Jews, you know, the memes will say the Jews were disproportionately involved in like a lot of the trading companies, but he shows that they played like pretty small roles in the East and West Dutch trading companies and the Royal African Company from Britain, stuff like that. And he ends off saying that phase 3, which is, you know, numerically where the most Africans were shipped over, is when the decline of Jews and New Christians occurred. So that's basically how he portrays it. And again, the whole Jewish involvement in the slave trade, like that they're even focusing on, isn't necessarily like from Africa. In Africa itself, it clearly wasn't Jews, you know, involved there. It was more just like the conversos in South America, and then Jews in the Caribbean, but they were mainly just, I guess, like midway merchant people. And again, didn't ever really dominate. At certain points, they were disproportionately involved, but again, that's not too crazy if you just consider like Jews as merchants in general. Like that's what they did, and no one's excusing like slavery and stuff, but to portray it as like a Jewish dominated thing is like pretty silly. And you can also look at the book Jews, Slaves, and the Slave Trade by Eli Faber, Setting the Record Straight. This was one of those books that responded to the Nation of Islam, and he has a bunch of tables in there showing Jewish participation in the slave trade, and I'm not even sure if it could even be called a disproportionate role or not, because I don't know necessarily every table he lists the Jewish population, so it might be proportional, it might be disproportional, I don't really know, but at the end of the day, it's like really clear. I mean, Jews just didn't dominate it. That's like the main thing. Like no one's denying that they were involved, and maybe at certain points, especially new Christians, were disproportionately involved, but overall, these memes are just kind of silly and basically just like divide and conquer. Like, oh, we're going to focus on like a small group of people to get the ire of like, I don't know, blacks away from white people or something stupid. I mean, the whole thing of being pissed off about slavery and having like a racial animus about it is, I mean, I hate to sound like a basic bitch person, but like everyone was involved in slavery at some point. Every group has enslaved another, and it's best to like move on. But it's kind of ironic when like white nationalists use this trope against Jews when like they complain about, you know, white people being demonized for being involved in the slave trade. Like the whole thing is stupid and silly, and the facts are what they are. So yeah, I mean, it deserves a response, and that's what I have hoped to do with this video. So thanks.